Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Hala Aldosari. I'm a visiting scholar here at the Arab Gulf State Institute. And by training, I'm a health researcher. I've done my PhD on violence against women, researching risk factors for violence in Saudi Arabia. Basically, why I got interested in the personal status law is because this type of law, though codified or not, in most of the Gulf countries, are so much linked to different domains in women's life. They control women's access to resources. They control how women can escape violence by putting certain restrictions on divorce, on marriage, on child custody that limits the ability of women to escape violence at home. Basically, even reproductive rights, authority over the children, access to paid jobs, commute and travel are all very much interlinked. And they're also linked to the criminal law in the way that it treats women that run away from her home, regardless of her age, or choose to reside in a different place than her home or family home. So on the process, I've realized that laws, whether codified or not, are not often used to create options or barriers, but they enforce certain social norms and influence the gender relations and roles in family. And they control the access to resources or to the rights through the various claims of preserving the tradition or certain religious values. So the work on violence cannot be really accomplished in prevention or intervention without looking at the restrictions that are in place in personal status law. In GCC, the personal status laws are based largely on Islamic opinions, whether they were codified or not. They result in most of the countries that codified that there are subtle differences in women's legal access to rights. But factors such as globalization, active citizens agency, and reform of procedural laws have helped certain initiatives and reforms of the existing laws. Our event today will provide a snapshot of the multidisciplinary nature of the efforts needed to create an egalitarian personal status law. So in preparation for this event, I've recorded an interview with Isra Al-Amiri, and she's a Kuwaiti lawyer and women's rights activist who have helped putting up a draft of law for violence against women and shared with other women activists personal status law reform in a project called Waraqati, and you're all invited to look into that. It's on our website with an English caption translation. And as well, I feel like there are other initiatives that should be mentioned, like Mawadda organization in Saudi, which give a good example of the collaboration of officials with NGOs to basically makes the procedural law more amenable and more supportive of women's and children's impacted by divorce. With us here is Dr. Mohammad Fadel, and he's the Associate Professor and Chair of Canada Research for the Law and Economics of Islamic Law at the University of Toronto. He has published several papers on family law, liberalism, and Islam, and he will discuss with us today the process of codification within Islamic family law. We have as well Dr. Kent Davis-Packard, and she's the co-executive director of Women's Learning Partnership, and she has extensive professional expertise in several universities and institutions. Her work is focused on women and human rights, and she will discuss today the work of her organization in basically measuring restrictions on women's rights in Muslim majority countries and how GCC or the Gulf countries fare in this regard. Loujayn Alhokail is a Saudi PhD candidate, and she is at the University of Toronto. Her work focuses on personal status law and the influence of the socio-political factors. She will discuss with us today the case of the guardianship system and how it permeates and prevails the articles of the personal status law. She was among my circle of concerned citizens in Saudi Arabia who started looking some years back into the personal status law and how can we think of reform. So I'll start with Dr. Fadel on codification. Okay. So we'll start with Dr. Kent with an overview of the situation of Muslim majority, just to introduce the talk, and then we'll move to Dr. Fadel.
So I'm going to, first of all, thank you to the Arab Gulf States Institute for inviting me, and to Dr. Hala Aldosari. I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of personal status laws or family law in the GCC and the rest of the MENA region. In the Middle East and North Africa, several legal systems are used. Some of them are based only on Islamic Sharia law, that's Yemen, Iran, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. But most countries use a hybrid legal system. They combine a version of French, British, or Egyptian legal codes with Sharia. The personal status law, or family code, regulates matters such as marriage, divorce, and child custody. And those are all governed by Sharia, apart from in Turkey and Tunisia, where family laws are drawn mostly from secular sources. Although the concept of Sharia itself remains a bit out of reach, since it all depends on interpretation of the Islamic texts, which differs from country to country. In addition, in Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, and Sudan, religious minorities can actually apply whichever religiously based law they wish to matters of personal status. In countries such as Bahrain, Kuwait, and Lebanon, the courts are separated into Sunni and Shiite hearings. But no matter which country you are in, the legal system is discriminatory against women, particularly in relation to the personal status codes. Male guardianship over women in the family is then replicated in male authority over women in all areas of decision-making in the public sphere. As opposed to civil, criminal, and administrative law in the area of personal status laws impact women primarily, while most other laws are based on civil codes, often mixed with European traditions. So women are bearing the burden of these societies' needs to maintain some sense of Islamic religious law and Islamic identity. It took a while to get to the place we are today, however, with family law in the MENA region. It was not actually until the mid-20th century that most Muslim countries enacted statutory family codes upon gaining independence. The Arab Gulf states, however, did not. So why not? The thinking is that one reason for the lack of real family law reform in the Arab Gulf monarchies is their distinct economic situations. Qatar, the UAE, and to a lesser extent Bahrain are rentier states. That means their oil and gas revenues allow them to cushion some of the negative social and economic side effects of traditional Islamic law through the distribution of generous governmental benefits. Meanwhile, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE did carry out some reforms of family law through codification. Previously, family issues were decided based on each judge's interpretation of Islamic law. They did this following the earlier lead of Kuwait and Oman in the 2000s. However, codification, as you'll hear from Dr. Fadel, is a controversial method for reform and has not necessarily served to advance women's rights, especially in the realm of marriage in these countries. The new family codes coincided with the three states' ratifications of major human rights treaties, CEDAW in particular. All three Gulf states have modeled the law on divorce after reforms already introduced in other Arab Muslim countries, such as Egypt and Jordan. But the greatest reforms to family law in the MENA region have occurred in Tunisia first and then Morocco. The promulgation of the Tunisian Code of Personal Status in 1956 constituted a radical shift in the interpretation of Islamic laws with regard to the family. Although the Moroccan reforms of 2004 do not go quite as far, they put Morocco as second in place with regard to women's rights in the region. But turning back to the Gulf, there is one unique country that is still not codified its personal status laws, although I just heard from Dr. Fadel this morning that it's arguable that family laws are not entirely codified in any country, it could be argued, in the MENA region. But some experts say that this allows the law to become flexible to reforms, although at present, judges and courts rule based on their own interpretations of religious texts, which could and have led to arbitrary decisions. So I'm going to cite Nathan Brown from George Washington University, an expert on Egypt and Sharia law, because he asked a very important question in a 2012 foreign policy article. He said, so why is codification of laws, merely writing down what the laws are, seen as repugnant steps by many of Saudi Arabia's most powerful religious scholars? First, there's a basic problem with the term codification, which is rendering God's law into man-made legislation. It's an almost sacrilegious concept in Saudi Arabia. But even more, they look very disapprovingly at what the codification has meant in neighboring states. It has generally been European, often French law that has been brought in by centralizing states interested in systematizing their legal systems. The most influential religious scholars in Saudi Arabia would object even to such an attempt to codify Islamic legal principles. It is not so much writing them down that would bother them, it is obliging the individual judge to follow those texts. Religious scholars feel that they should not be bound by whatever rulers have decreed to be the authoritative version of that tradition. While judges might look to various sources for guidance, no one person has final authority. So the king is respectful of the judiciary. Many scholars are convinced that the king is right, noting that most judges are probably not sufficiently knowledgeable to develop interpretations of Islamic law entirely on their own. Codification might thus be a way, argues Nathan Brown, of enforcing Sharia-based rules rather than avoiding them. It might even bring back under their jurisdiction matters that had been transferred to quasi-judicial bodies. Despite this tension between the desire to codify and the inability to intervene in the interpretive process, more reform efforts in the Gulf are underway. In Kuwait, for example, the lawyer that Dr. Hala just mentioned has mentioned in her interview, which you can find on the website, that she and other activists in Kuwait are attempting to raise the minimum age of marriage to 18, to enact a law to legally criminalize violence against women, and to add the husband to the existing articles criminalizing sexual harassment and rape, and criminalizing marital rape. And all of that, I can go on, but I will stop there. All of that is tied to our global campaign, Women's Learning Partnership, which is an NGO based here in Washington and Lebanon, and actually in 20 countries around the world, primarily Muslim-majority countries. We just launched the global campaign in New York at the Commission on the Status of Women, linking discriminatory family laws to violence against women. And so if you are interested in knowing more, we put out a call for applications actually for researchers to carry out our case studies in 11 countries. And we'll have a documentary film, a conference, a new manual, and so we can talk about the campaign as the discussion continues.
Great. So thank you, Dr. Kent. But one important question is that it's as if we have to choose between going in a non-Islamic way of codification, as if codification by necessity means either enforcing an Islamic way of thinking or ruling, or enforcing a non-Islamic way. But I think there is a margin where we can find consensus among Islamic schools of thought, not necessarily the predominant Islamic schools of thoughts, but we can find rooms where there is some kind of alliance between values that would preserve the dignity of different members in the family, and that really upholds the basic principles of Islam. So has that ever been an issue in the codification or in the discussion of scholars around codification?
I think that is certainly true, and there has been some consensus reached in some cases. I think that Dr. Fadel would be able to answer that question better than I can.
Okay, great. So we'll move to Dr. Fadel now and the codification question, the big codification question.
Okay, thank you, Hala. Thank you very much for the Arab Gulf States Institute for inviting me here. It's my pleasure to be among friends talking about a very, very, very important topic. And so let me begin by asking the question, why codification? I think in the last 150 years, the Arab region and maybe the Islamic world in general has seen a shift in the legal system from one that relied primarily on judge-made laws to enforcement of codes, of a code-based legal system. And this has generally been associated with a broad kind of Enlightenment concept of progress, so that codes have been associated by definition with the achievement of some sort of social progress. I want to bracket that for a second and say, well, what do we mean by progress? I don't want to reject the idea of progress at all, but it's important to ask, what kinds of progressive goals do we think codes further? So I think it depends on who is advocating the goal. So some people might advocate codes because they're hoping that codes will result in substantive reforms to the content of people's rights and obligations in a way that makes society better, right? So it wants to alter the balance, the social balance of rights, or the distribution of rights and obligations in society in a way that they consider to be closer to justice. Other people, like political elites, for example, might view codification simply as an instrumental tool to allow them to exercise greater control over society, right? And according to Nathan Brown, whom Dr. Kent already mentioned, he thinks that was the central motivation for codification in the Ottoman Empire and post-Ottoman Empire states, namely that they saw in Islamic law an obstacle to exercising more effective control over society because it was relatively decentralized and gave a lot of power to judges. If you adopt a French-style civil system, on the other hand, judges become directly subordinate to the executive, and it becomes a lot easier for the sovereign to exercise its will over society. So, depending on the nature of the sovereign, that might be good or it might be horrific, right? So we have to sort of question that motive for codification. And finally, there might be another reason, and I think you saw this also in a place like the United States in the 19th century. The United States, in many ways, I would argue that the common law system bears fundamental resemblance, structural resemblance to the Islamic legal system in the sense that both systems relied heavily on judge-made law. But nevertheless, you see in the United States in the 19th century a greater movement toward codification of the common law, an attempt to reduce common law principles to statutes. And this culminates, of course, in the 20th century with things like the Uniform Commercial Code, and the American Legal Law Institute produces like these statements of broad areas of law that are persuasive authority but not binding. So that's why do we do that here? Well, because I think the idea is what you want to do is promote greater transparency, accountability, and predictability within a context of judge-made law, right? So here you can talk about at least 3 different motivations for why you want codification, right? And so one question before you urge codification is think about, why do we want codification? Do we want it for substantively progressive reasons? Well, that requires a different kind of justification and political strategy. Do you want it because you want to improve the efficacy of central rule? Well, that's a different kind of justification. Third, do you want it just to promote greater transparency, accountability, and predictability in the judicial system? That's sort of another set of rules, or another set of justifications and reasons. Okay. Now, I'm going to focus exclusively on this notion that codification is an effective means of generating sociological progress, right? Sort of a progressive argument for codification, resting on the idea that judge-made law is bad, like let's say judge-made Islamic law is especially bad, let's say, and we're going to replace it with a progressive code that's going to improve the status of women, et cetera. Well, this assumes that the law is going to be effective in society, right? And that in of itself is very problematic. In many societies, law can be effective in transforming society. In other societies, people could care less what the law says, right? So the effectiveness of law as a tool of social change is contingent on lots of factors, right? I personally think one of the great problems that we suffer in the Arab world is because law, or modern law in the Arab world, is so instrumental that it has no internal moral value from the perspective of the average Arab citizen. So the average Arab citizen is completely, generally indifferent to the law to the extent that the law has no direct coercive force on him, right? So it has very limited utility in terms of social transformation in contexts where the state do not have the power to enforce their will on every individual. And states in the Arab world are typically very weak, so it seems to me very unlikely that a codification of family law will be successful in transforming the status of women in Arab countries, because there's just not enough coercive resources available to actually force social change down people's throats. So you need another way of transforming society besides legal reform as such. Not saying that legal reform is not a useful tool, but it cannot be the end-all and end-all of social transformation. If not, it has to be combined with other kinds of strategies such that society internalizes the law. When I mean internalize it, that means they follow it because they think it's the right thing to do, right? And so that's going to require a lot more work than simply having an authoritarian government issue new rules. That's not going to do very much, at least in my opinion. So that brings me to my third point. There's a politics behind codification. In my first remarks about the different motives behind why we might have a code, it already suggested. Each one of those reasons for codification suggests a different kind of politics at play. So if you want to have a code whose goal is to promote progressive social change, you need to have some kind of politics that allows for that. And in my opinion, you need the best kind of politics that allows for that is democratic politics, because democratic politics empowers individual citizens to be self-governing, and so therefore it allows them, through debate and deliberation and discussion about the impacts of the law, the moral significance of the law, for them to learn about the law and internalize it and therefore conform with it because they want to conform with it, right? Not because they're forced to. And I think this is actually a big problem, whether we're talking about Islamic law or non-Islamic law in the Arab world. As somebody who studies Islamic law, I realize that the median Muslim knows very, very, very little about Islamic law. So you can't really describe them as behaving in accordance with Islamic law. They may justify a lot of what they do on an ex post basis on Islamic law, but they actually have no idea oftentimes about what the content of Islamic law on issues such as freedom of movement for women, freedom to be from violence from women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? People oftentimes confuse their own prejudice and bias for the content of Islamic law. So that we need, I think, a strategy about how to internalize legal values, whether they're Islamic or non-Islamic. The problem is the same. How do you motivate citizenry to follow the law? And it's complicated if you have societies that are not under democratic governance, at least in my opinion. And then finally, there's the question of the content of the codes, right? You can't take for granted that a codification is going to give you something better, right? Now, if we're talking specifically in the context of the Arab Muslim world, I would think that the vast majority of the issues that at least that have been presented here are easily solvable just within looking at historical Islamic law. One doesn't even need to do creative or bizarre or outlandish reinterpretation to find solutions to the particular problems that have been raised so far in this panel regarding domestic violence, mobility, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is you have to have the will to learn about these things and the will to adopt them and the will to follow them, right? And this also gets back to this question I said about internalization. How do you get people to want these things, right? And so that, to me, really is the sum and substance of the issue here. It's not that we are sort of genetically incapable of these reforms, nor is it normatively problematic for us, but we have to have the freedom and the institutions and the will to enable us to adopt them in a way that's effective and will be broadly legitimate, right? Which I think, at the end of the day, is going to require some kind of broad-based political reform throughout the region, not just the Gulf. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Fadel. I'm just gonna interfere with one question here. I know that in Egypt, for instance, when they allowed khula, which is annulment of marriage initiated by the women, there was a 90% increase in requests for ending the marriage or annulment of marriage in 1 year. So I know that some understand the idea that we need to wait for basically include most of the agents or citizens in the process of reforming the law. But sometimes maybe reforming through the law would give those people, those marginalized people or marginalized sectors of the society, some resources, like what happened in Egypt.
Well,
not to basically discredit the idea of basically a wholesome political reform. Or
No,
social
but see, that's
reform.
actually an excellent example. Before that law was adopted, it actually was preceded by extensive public debate and discussion, right? It wasn't, it didn't come out of nowhere, out of the blue, and just drop down into an unsuspecting society. In fact, it had been subject to a lot of public deliberation and discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it was controversial, people knew what was going on, right? And so there was a ready constituency for it, right? And so it had already been assimilated. Now, when I speak about the connection between reform and democracy, right? These things aren't black and white, right? There are democratic spaces in the Arab world, but what I'm saying is that because they're so narrow and tight, the space for real reform is likewise narrow and tight. Like I have my own criticisms of the 2000 Hala law. I don't think it went nearly far enough, but because the state is so fragile, it leaves its space for maneuver is extremely small, right?
Yeah.
So the broader participation you have in society, and the greater legitimacy that accords the state, and so the greater the reforms can be.
Yeah.
As long as the state its base of legitimacy is extremely narrow, it's going to be extremely reluctant to challenge ideas, and this is the basic dilemma.
Yeah, but I think one of the main issues in those type of societies and countries is how you can work with this such narrow margin of basically citizen mobilization or call for reforms when this is not a democratic society, when you can't really enact much of change. So you have to do with some piecemeal, basically fashion. But I'm gonna stop here and let Loujayn start her paper on the guardianship.
Thank you, Hala, and thanks to the Arab Gulf Institute for organizing the event and allowing us to have this discussion on these important issues. I'm going to talk about the process of codification in Saudi Arabia. Now, Dr. Kent touched a little bit about codification and resistance and the reason behind the resisting any code or any attempt in the past. Now, the absence of codification does affect women negatively. It affects their ability to know their rights and to invoke specific provisions in court. It also gives judges the authority to choose whatever opinion they see fit. For example, in 2013, it was found that the woman's right to have access to fasq depends on the judge she's appearing in front of and his view and whether he was willing to give her access to divorce or not. But the question is, will codification improve women's access to justice? Today, I want to focus specifically on the male guardianship system and the culture around it. I find that addressing the issue or any attempt to codify codification without addressing the issue of male guardianship system and the culture will create resistance of the law, that is, if that specific code does not reinforce the traditions that are supported by the male guardianship system. It will also put women's access to that code under the discretion and cooperation of her male guardian. Now, to just give an understanding of the male guardianship system, I take a very wide approach to it, and I define it as a set of laws, policies, and tradition that combine put women's access to their rights, including the legally recognized rights, under the discretion of their male guardian. Part of the system include women are unable to have access to travel, education, or issue passport without the consent of their male guardian. Female prisoners are not allowed to exit prison after the end of their sentence without their male guardians. Male guardians can sue women for disobedience. Other policies that are not directly related but are designed to strengthen and maintain the authority of the male guardian, like gender segregation and the ban on women driving. There's also the lack of laws and procedures in case of a male guardian abuses his authority in the name of tradition, and also not enforcing changes that were made against that culture. For example, labor law in 2008 removed the requirement that a woman must get the permission of her male guardian to work, yet still many places still ask for permission, and it is to protect themselves because they know unless they don't get the permission of their male guardian that the woman may not come to work. So it's more than just laws and policies. It's more a culture that shapes citizen legal consciousness and shapes their own understanding of Islamic law. This culture is maintained through laws and policies, but also through messages that citizens receive in everyday life, through publications, journal articles, but also through education. Due to the limited time you have today, I just want to focus on education and the role of education in maintaining the existence of that system. If we take a look at school curricula, for example, 12th grade students are taught very specific and narrow interpretation of Islamic law. For example, they are taught that a divorced woman, if she wants to get remarried, she has to give up the custody of her children, which is one of the opinions under Islamic law, but they are taught that the reason behind that is she must attend and serve, attend to her new husband's needs and serve him. She must be available for him, which create the idea that women were created to serve their husbands, even if it's at the expense of their children. Another rule that is taught is that if a boy reaches the age of 7 and he gets to choose between his parents if they are divorced. If he chooses his father, then he lives full-time with him, but if he chooses his mother, he lives with her during the night, but with his father during the day, because only his father can discipline him. If it's a daughter, she always stays with her father. These kind of rules undermine the role of women in her children's life above the age of 7. From grades 9 to 12, they are taught that a woman is all awra, meaning that her face, her body, and her voice is sinful to non-related men. She's compared to the expensive jewel, that she must be covered and protected and maintained. These teachings do affect a woman when she goes to court and she addresses a male judge. When she's taught that her voice is awra, it may affect her ability to speak freely, or even sometimes it has been recorded that some judges refuse to hear from women or refuse to address them if they're not properly covered. Other schools take it further. For example, there was an image showing a young girl covered from head to toe, kneeling to her father, asking him, "Father, you are the only one who's capable of protecting me. Make sure that I'm well covered before I leave home." Or that a man's masculinity is judged by the way the women in his family are covered. Other rules, and just looking at education, for example, in universities, women are not allowed to exit the university before, some universities before noon, without the consent of her male guardian, not allowed to exit the housing without the consent of their male guardian. Now, these messages, whether explicit or implicit, that students and citizens receive everywhere, that teach them that women are in constant need of protection, that women are awra, that women are worth less than men, that men have authority over women. And then when we look at the law and we find it support these laws, for example, the woman's diya is half as much as the man's diya, or that a woman is a guardian of a man, it does affect the process of codifying the law or applying a code, any code that goes against these teachings and this current culture. Now, I find it necessary to acknowledge that there is a shift in the culture that's happening. Female lawyers, since they've been licensed to practice law in 2009, they've been educating the public about their rights. Advocates through blogs and articles and social media are continuously challenging these ideas. Even Islamic scholars who are bringing into service opinions and proving that the male guardianship system is not related to Islamic law and that there are a lot of opinions against it. Clerics who issue fatwas, and most importantly, internet and social media that provided citizens with room to debate and have access to opinions and understand what Islamic law provides. But there is more need to be done. On the ground, we must provide opportunities for students, academics, lawyers, decision makers to engage with each other through conferences, workshops, and panels. At the same time, with widening the scope of freedom of expression and allowing them to debate different opinions and to challenge these things that are taught and discussed. Most importantly, involve women in these discussions and in the decision-making process itself. Reevaluate publications and school curricula, for example, and make sure that includes a variety of opinions, that it acknowledges that fiqh can change and can accommodate more than one opinion. Also acknowledge the roles of women and that they have important roles in Islamic history and in life. And of course, we must take steps starting to limit the authority of the male guardian while aiming to end the male guardianship system completely.
Thank you. Thank you. Such an interesting thing, and really touching on so many important messages that can be very subtle and ingrained into the societal conscience, that it is very difficult basically to pick, and it can pass to women's, subconscious, and they can act accordingly. Like, I monitored so many different women who take different positions according to the setting that they are in. They would be more open and talkative, maybe on a different platform, but in the presence of officials, especially from the state, I noticed how reserved and how conformed actually to the social norm than they are. And this is one of the challenges. How can we present, even with the changes in conscience, even with the changes of acknowledgement that women do really realize the restrictions and the impact of maybe discriminatory culture against them. But at the same time, they are always in a presence of male-dominated culture, which might be a little bit alien to what they aspire for. So how can these women push the envelope when they realize that they might be rejected by their own culture?
Well, I think women are starting to. As I said, like, I do feel that social media have created some kind of safe space for women to engage. But as you said, it's hard without having official channels, without supporting these discussions on the ground in universities, making universities a safe place for people to critique, to discuss, and to engage with each other, not...
Yeah, without a political will, I mean. Yeah. Exactly, that's perfect. So we'll open the floor for questions now.
See that much in women rights or any rights, because we suffer in Saudi Arabia that we cannot even hold a meeting to discuss things and to try to change the state of mind of people, because we cannot get permission from the government to hold a meeting. In the other side, the people who are enforcing these ideas about women being to have a guardianship and to have she is not a full citizen, they have the whole floor for them to form the state of mind of people. So I believe without political change, we are just running in an empty circle.
Yeah, but I think it's a process, right? Well, Dr. Fadel,
It's 100% open.
Yeah.
And there's no society, maybe even, I don't know, I've never been to North Korea, but that's 100% closed,
Yeah.
right? And so,
There is 99.
so I guess you have to work with what's available,
Yeah.
right? You have to work with those. And I have to say, since I've been teaching at University of Toronto, I've had the pleasure of interacting with lots of students from the Gulf. I've been very impressed with their commitment to their societies and their openness and their desire to learn. And so I'm hopeful, that there's change in the wind, so to speak. And to be honest, right? Some of the factors that have kept the Gulf or allowed the Gulf to sort of, I guess, put in place a kind of certain very, very rigid social structures. I think it's getting harder and harder to maintain that as the place of oil in the world economy is declining.
Yeah.
Because, ordinarily, you couldn't sustain a society along these lines because it's so destructive of social productivity. Sometimes I wonder, why do Saudi men put up with these rules? Who has time to take his daughter everywhere, right? Well, if everything is cared, if you don't need to do anything because everything is given to you because of oil rents, then okay, fine. It's sort of a pain for me to drive my wife everywhere or whatever, but I guess I don't have to be very productive. But in a society where you actually have to be productive to survive, then lots of these rules will drop out on their own. So there will be external changes that will force even societies that don't want to change to abandon some of these rules. So, I don't expect any Arab country much less Saudi Arabia, to become Canada tomorrow. But I do think that things will get better, inshallah, right?
May I respond to that
Sure.
as well? So I think, so the question really is, how do you get political change? And that is, how do you get culture change? How do you arrive at an entirely different mindset or consciousness among populations so that they can support governments that might be willing to make the reforms? Which is why you need to appeal to something that is universally looked down upon. And that's why a number of women's organizations, Women's Learning Partnership, has launched this campaign that actually takes what Dr. Hala said at the beginning, the link between discriminatory family laws and violence against women as the basis for a campaign for reform, because even the most conservative clerics look down on violence against women, and it is a way in, a foot in the door, to make the argument that there should be some reform, because these are universal human rights. The idea that a child could be married at age 8, that a woman can't divorce her husband even when he's beating her. And so that is one way that we're doing this. And to give you a sense of some other means by which we can transform culture and women can become active parts of that, we're producing an online platform that shows the different interpretations of the laws in all of the different countries related to personal status codes, so that women in one country can see, oh, they do it differently in this other country. They can also share best practices. So we're using technology and the internet to allow women to learn from one another, to network, to work in partnership across national boundaries to reform the law.
Question of which laws are hardest to change. And in Morocco, for example, I'm going back to that, they made some rather important reforms in family law, but the Minister of Social Affairs said we can't change inheritance because that's set. And so even though there's much more equality in the family, the inheritance laws remain the way they are. And can you tell me which laws are difficult to change and why?
Depends, I guess, on what your idea of a legitimate rule is. But I guess if you're talking in an Islamic country, generally speaking, the more clear the rule is in the Quran, then it's harder to change. Now, I might give you an argument as to why I don't think inheritance is that really big of a problem, as people might think. But, again, Morocco is an excellent example of what I'm saying. I mean, I think that there's a big difference between what the code says and what goes on in daily life, not only in society, but also even in courts, right? It's not quite clear to what extent courts have actually been following the new code, right? And so there's a big problem in terms of, the take-up of top-down reform. And so a lot of this has to do with what people think, sort of by default, is the right thing, the natural thing, et cetera. And that's where it gets hard to change things, even beyond. So there's sort of a formal legal problem, like, okay, so the Quran says that within the same class of inheritors, the male should get twice that of the female, so that's an explicit rule. But maybe there's a reason why it can be overcome if we want to. But more importantly, is that there's a naturalization of the assumption that this is the right thing to do, so that people would think it would be unfair if I gave my daughter the same share as my son, right? And my son would think it'd be terribly unfair, right? And so there are two levels. There's sort of a jurisprudential argument that one might make, and then the second argument is, well, how do you overcome, or how do you convince people that there's a need to change it, right? And I think that's sort of the more difficult thing to do.
Could you elaborate more on how to convince people of the need to enforce laws and how they could progress the status of women and citizens in general?
Well, I think we need to begin with the idea that a woman in Islamic law is a rights-bearing person, right? She is a person that God created, that she has obligations first to her creator, just like anybody else, and she has rights that everybody has to respect, that she just doesn't exist to serve other people, right? Just as God is going to judge her for what she does, as he will men. He also gave her rights so that she can live in this life as a respectable, honorable person, and that everybody needs to respect those rights. And Islamic law recognizes her as a rights-bearing person, right? And then in Islamic law, generally speaking, autonomy is a very valuable thing. There's a very famous Egyptian Syrian jurist who said, "Hajr al-mar'i an al-istiqlal bimanafi' nafsihi mafsada," right? So that is a basic principle of Islamic law. It doesn't matter whether it's a man or a woman. Interfering in somebody's private rights is a bad thing, generally speaking. It requires a very, very, very good reason to justify interfering in somebody's private rights. And we have to show a little skepticism, just as we show skepticism when somebody wants to interfere in my rights because I'm a man. Why do we show such little skepticism when people give the flimsiest reasons to justify interference in what would be considered a woman's right? Right? It's not though we don't recognize that women have these rights. We just say, oh, they're not as important because of these other things, right? And see, this is where we're talking about ins. This is where I think the in is. It says, no, we have to be just as skeptical about reasons that would limit a woman's right as we would for a man. And that's where I see the real invidious discrimination in the Arab world, is that it's not that we don't recognize that women have rights. It's just that we're willing to accept a lot lower threshold of a justification to limit those rights than we do for a man. Like, for a man, we'll make every kind of excuse as to why we shouldn't limit his freedom. But for a woman, the trivialest reason will justify limiting her freedom. And that's really where I think we have to focus attention.
Great.
May I also respond? One thing another mechanism for getting people to want to make change is by having something called a witness series, where you interview women about the impact of the law on them, and it becomes public on the internet. And it's very compelling because you hear personalized stories about what one specific law did to one specific woman, and then it becomes a universal story and everyone can relate to it. So that's another part of our campaign. But there's also something else that is missing from a lot of societies in the Middle East and North Africa, and that is a safe space for women to deliberate on these issues. I think women's rights are generally a taboo subject as they relate to Islamic law, as they relate to personal status codes. So that's another thing that many women's organizations are doing. They are creating these trainings around the world, and you wonder, what is it that they're all meeting in a room and talking about this? What is that really doing? But actually it's doing a lot, because it's one of the only places that women can feel comfortable if it's done in the right way, in a safe way, with facilitators who have manuals who can actually call on universal human rights principles with a degree of authority and educate the women and their communities about their rights. That's just another way to create that kind of consciousness in local communities.
And I'll just add one more thing before taking another question. Basically, from my own experience, it really helps to basically treat those people who claim that they are authorities in religion as you treat everyone else. So no one is an authority in religion, really, because it's religion. If it's applicable to me as it's applicable to a man, if it's applicable to anything, so it should be scrutinized. It should be part of a public debate. It should not be protected and saved as a right for certain religious authorities. It should be everybody's business. So I think that really helps in such closed societies.
We need to understand what shapes these opinions and address it from that way. For example, in Saudi Arabia, where it shapes support of male guardianship system comes from the attachment between male guardianship system and Islamic law. So if we start breaking that connection and proving that it's not related and that there are other opinions that support otherwise, then we start by allowing women to shape their opinion in a different way by different factors that may lead to them believing that they deserve their rights.
You mentioned about the need to shape citizens' legal consciousness, and I was wondering if in the last electoral process where women were allowed to run for office the first time, was there any debate about how to change or raise awareness among women about their legal rights, about the laws that they should know about. And I remember here the previous panel you had about this topic, about elections in Saudi Arabia, and one of your speakers said how women, how little women know in Saudi Arabia about the laws and what's, what they can do and what they are allowed to do and not.
I wouldn't call it shaping citizens' consciousness, but rather giving them opportunity to look at more options, like see what have currently shaped their opinion and give them access to more resources and more, so that they can truly have a full picture, and then they would be able to, through their own experience, have a legal consciousness of their own. Now, as your question about the elections,
Women
I
don't
believe
know.
you're...
Women don't know their rights and how they can access it. Is that? Do you think that this is what's happening in Saudi?
That women don't know their rights. It is hard for a woman to know her rights in Saudi Arabia. There is no code. There is no, for example, Islamic, there is no reference. Once you go to journal articles, you find just reference to a variety of opinions. So it's hard to understand which one, and to predict which one is the judge going to apply in your case. So it's really hard. Even as a lawyer, you can't answer the questions like, what's the law regarding a certain issue? Like, what are the, for example, grounds of divorce? Like, some judges say it's this, some judges recognize that. So that's one of the problems that a code may help, but also there are issues regarding codification at this certain time that it may just freeze laws and make it rigid and make it hard to change. So yeah, currently it's hard for women to know their rights, and with the prevalence of the male guardianship system, and as I mentioned, the strict laws that are taught, and it's challenging for women to have access to either court or to a fair outcome once they go inside the courthouse.
I know Morocco was mentioned a few times, and I was wondering if someone could speak to the Morshidat program, in which women are religious leaders in their communities, and how that influences perhaps changes in personal status laws or greater understanding among women of their rights, and then even addressing violence against women or violent extremism, and then also if that could be translated to other countries.
I don't know that much about the Morshidat program. The Morshidat program, for those who don't know about it, it's a program that the Ministry of Endowments and Religious Affairs in Morocco has established, whereby they're basically training females to be preachers, popular preachers, specifically to target Muslim women in Morocco, to teach them more about Islam and their rights under Islamic law and Moroccan law generally, right? And so I think it's been pretty successful, right, generally speaking. But I think there's a limit to how much you can rely on programs like that to achieve social reform in the absence of good courts, effectively funded courts, effectively funded social services. I'll give an example. I studied Maliki law, and I think in many ways Maliki law is extremely progressive on family law issues. For example, when it comes to domestic violence, at least the black letter law says once it becomes public, the state has no option but to intervene. A woman should be taken out of a home where she's accused of domestic violence, where she's accused her husband of domestic violence, and be placed in a safe space. There's an obligation on the state, right? Not a 20th century form, right? This is like from the 8th century. But the problem is a state has to have resources to do these things. So lots of times, you can have a great law in theory, but if you don't have the political will to take it out, to implement it, it's a dead letter. And I think lots of the problems in Morocco is that so many institutions are not sufficiently funded to be able to carry out the mandates that they're supposed to do, right? And so this is where political reform and legal reform really have to go hand in hand. You can't, these reforms will not be effective without sufficient commitment to building effective political institutions, and that's the difficulty, I think.
And may I just give you an example of some of the reforms that happened in Morocco? I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, but just as an example, this is 2004. husband and wife share joint responsibility for the family. What does that mean, and how can that be enforced? And you can imagine how difficult it is if it, culturally, this is not something that men and women are accustomed to doing, how it could be enforced by the law. Another one is the wife is no longer legally obliged to obey her husband. What is that? When do we obey our husband? They ask us to do something. This is another point that makes it very difficult. It's got to be a cultural change, and that's why you've got to do it at the grassroots level. Of course, I'm coming from NGO side of things, but that is the reason why NGOs focus so much, obviously, on the grassroots, because you have to make it possible for the everyday woman in Morocco to be able to discuss openly with her husband in a safe space what these new laws could possibly mean to them and their families. And they determine it. You don't have an outsider come in. You don't have the government come in. The people themselves determine what that means for their families and what is equality at the family level. And if you have equality at the level of the family, you can then have it in your local community. You can then have it in government. But you cannot have it if you do not have equality in the level of the family.
Response right now have been emphasizing grassroots and the need for social change and ultimately political change, and kind of these big, large shifts that will happen from below. But I wanted to just explore at least the potential in the Gulf states for state-backed change. I know, Professor Fadel, you mentioned that, kind of gave the example that you're skeptical about this kind of change because states are very weak to do that, but we do in the Gulf states have states with a lot of resources. I'm thinking in particular of states with small populations and huge resources like the UAE and Qatar, two states that at least on the surface or in a lot of their public policies have been promoting women's participation in a number of new areas. So I'm just wondering if some of you, I don't know if Loujayn or as well, Ms. Davis-Packard can talk about if those states are showing some promise in pushing in these other key areas of personal status, or if it's just something that's happening on a more symbolic level.
Sociological question. I don't really know. I don't know the details of how people live in the Gulf, but my perception is that extended families are still very, very strong, even in places like Qatar and the UAE. And it's it's almost inconceivable to me that a woman or, that a man, it would be very difficult for a man, much less for a woman, I think, to live as an individual in these societies without the support of their families and their extended families. Now, I don't know if the governments feel strong enough to enforce rights when individuals exercise them in a way that is in open defiance of what their extended family wants, right? And so, yeah, I think they can open some things up. They can make places for females to, to work for the government on an equal basis. Like, when I go to the UAE and I go to Qatar, I see women working as civil servants. But I guess the question would be, suppose a woman wants to work there and her husband doesn't want to, right? I'm not quite sure if she has the formal right to employment that the state is going to effectively protect that in the face of her husband and her husband's family rejection of that right. That's, to me, is the question.
No, the state does not allow it. Now, actually, in the Qatari law, there is an article that says that obedience is a duty of a wife, and the husband is not supposed to prevent his wife to basically pursue education, and they specify only compulsory education until the high school, and she should not work unless the husband prefers that she doesn't work or sees that the work really impacts her duty in the family. So there is an article in the law, actually, restricts women's access to work.
But I guess her question is, suppose they change that.
No,
Would
that's
it-
in her law.
But
not
suppose
in
they
the law.
change that. Would
Yeah.
Qatari women effectively be able to use that right in defiance of their families? That's where I'm skeptical. I just
Yeah.
don't know. Because
Yeah.
the whole economy is so completely dependent on rents, right?
Right.
So, it's not like you can go strike out on your own and get a job on your own, unconnected to the government, or get an apartment on your own, or something like that. Everything, one way or another, is connected back to the government, and the government is connected to powerful families. And all of them have sort of an interest in keeping this system as it is. At least that's how it strikes me. I don't know.
So, Loujayn, you want to comment on that?
Actually,
What do you know of any
no
initiatives?
specific. I mean, like last law in favor of women, we had the law against domestic violence, but I don't really know what resources have been put to imply that. Probably
The implementation. It's exactly what Dr.
Yeah.
Fadel was saying, that you might have a law, but in implementation, there is not efficient implementation of the law, basically.
Yeah,
Even
so,
if it's on the level of the law, there is some kind of a change. But when it comes to officials in the government that carry the implementation of the law, it might not be as effective, or it might not really serve women.
So yeah, I like resources are not directly used in that way, but I believe that they are used in other ways that can eventually advance women's rights or change the culture. For example, investing in scholarships and supporting students to study abroad, being exposed to different cultures and different ideas, and then come back. I think in that way could change the culture in some way, but not directly in favor of women's right against the male guardianship system. I don't think we've reached that point yet.
When I listen to any discussion about women's rights, the only issue that we have is driving. As it's the only issue that women suffering in Saudi Arabia from. So I'm very happy for
They are suffering.
yeah, of course. So there's many issues. What I think, I have a couple comments and then a question for Loujayn. First, I think the political reform has nothing to do with the women's rights in Saudi. I think it's a cultural issue. And again, I'm saying it's a cultural issue. Why? Because every time when I'm listening to, let's say my friends, when we discuss this issue as a supporter for women's rights, they are just saying, no, this is their religion. They want to control women by saying this is their religion. If you want to say anything against that thing, that means you are against their religion. And they can see, you can remember that when King Abdullah just issued the order for allowing women to be in the Shura Council, and many things for helping women. My question for Loujayn, what do you think? There's no responsibility for women in Saudi, because every time when I talk to them about their rights, they don't have, I think, enough information. They cannot, and even if you see that there's no legal way, to informing women about their rights. What about the social media? What about first you have to informing women about their rights, and then asking for it, or getting the right, because some women fighting other women about the rights, and you can see that. I'm supporting, of course, the women's rights, and I know it's not. I mean, many issues in Saudi should be solved. I'm so sorry for that. But I would like to hear from you. What do you think, or what steps that you think the women should take to getting their rights? So sorry.
It's a very complicated issue in terms of political reform and rights, and because just looking at the history of Saudi Arabia and looking back and understanding the relationship between the state and religious institution, and how this relationship have developed over time, and the politics around it, religious nationalism that unites Saudi citizens, and it basically provides legitimacy for the Saudi government, which is an Islamic country. So not necessarily political reform, but I think it's just connected, that change can't happen unless the citizens reach a certain point where they understand and believe that this is not Islamic law, and that Islamic law means other things. Once they reach that point, then the government can start supporting changes. But for them to reach that point, the government has to support changes in education, for example, and gradual change. So it's it is a complicated matter that I believe very historical issue. But the role of women, I do believe women are already using social media, there are many women activists, but the thing is, unless you follow them, unless you read what they're saying, you're not gonna, people who are interested in their ideas are gonna read it and are gonna engage and are gonna debate. But if you're not interested and you just reject it and you do believe that no, what this person, مشروع تغريب or like westernization, and you immediately reject it without even reading it, then you can't. Other ways that women can do it, but you need support of universities, for example. If you can go to universities and talk to students there in formal ways, I think that would really help. What Mawadda did, provide free legal consultation for women in courts, continues to do workshops, and but again, unless you are willing to go, you're not gonna get that unless it's implemented in official education and curricula and official channels.
Dr. Hala, may I also respond just quickly? One, just at the risk of sounding radical, and I just want to throw out an idea for this whole conversation, and that is that at the core, this is not, discriminatory family laws are not religiously motivated by Islam necessarily. In fact, discriminatory family laws exist across the globe. They're not just in Muslim majority societies. So I think that we should ponder that, because it is a patriarchal structure that exists in every society, and you cannot call upon religion and cannot keep referencing only Islam to say that this is what's causing women and to be at a disadvantage at the level of the family.
Because I am from the United Arab Emirates, and I think no Arab Gulf country has gone where we need to go on the personal status law. The last time we had reforms was in 2005. But it was about, Dr. Fadel, maybe your point on which comes first, the actual change in the law, the legislative reform, or because the government had a political will and actually implemented things, the mindset and the culture has shifted. So to your point about, is a woman allowed to work without her guardian's permission? In black and white, technically she's not. But nobody that I have ever heard of in the UAE has been asked to have a guardian's permission to when they're starting a new job. There's been one case in the last 10 years that a husband has actually taken his wife to court to say she went to work without my permission. And that's the thing, that the mindset has shifted. There's a clear difference if anybody visits the UAE that you see in terms of women not necessarily knowing their rights, but in terms of, we have role models, we have the highest, we're doing the best in terms of political participation of women. At the cabinet level, it's almost a third women. 20% of our Federal National Council is women. There is something that has worked for us in terms of having a government will to actually say, you know what, we want to empower women, we want to have them there, even though we haven't physically changed in black and white the laws. The culture and the mindset has changed, and that came before we were actually able to. And maybe that's part of what you said about instilling and incorporating into people's way of life, that this is acceptable, that this is what we want. This is the model that we want to have women in all sectors, in all fields. So is it, like, we were talking about which necessarily come hand in hand, or do they come first? And I think that's something that we got right in the UAE, even though in black and white we still have a long way to go on fixing our...
For the other, they have to go hand in hand, if you can think of it sort of dialectically. So you have to think not only of what you want, sort of, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about what the law should be, and not a lot on how to make it effective in society, and I think you have to do both, right? So that's my cautionary tale about putting too much faith in codification. I personally think that, we Arab Muslims would be a lot better if we followed a common law system of law instead of a French civil system, because I think common law is much more amenable to solving the kinds of social conflict and disputes that we have, and also teaching people the content of the law. But, whatever. I wasn't around 150 years ago. Not that anybody would listen to me anyway, but it doesn't really matter. But, I do think common law has certain advantages sociologically in terms of internalization of the law and teaching the law vis-a-vis a civil law system. But yeah, I think the two have to go hand in hand. I'm not saying you can never have, states can interfere obviously to result in progressive change, but there has to be a certain kind of prerequisites that are established to make it successful. You just can't willy-nilly change society through acts of fiat. That's all I was trying to say, right? So there has to be equal thought given to how are you going to make these rules effective, right? And so I'm happy to hear that what you're saying is true in the UAE. I would be happier, right, if this was sort of like, to know the kinds of employment, right, that is available to women. If it's outside of the state sector, if it's like in the private sector, because that really creates genuine space for independence, right? If it's just a sort of, I tend to view like government employment as sort of an appendage of family connections, right? And so it's not necessarily a giant step forward. Yes, it's helpful, right? But and again, I don't think this is man or woman. I think it's very hard to live as an individual in the Arab world, period, because our political economy is such that it's very hard to make it on your own individual merits, is what I'm trying to say, right? And it's very hard to develop a rights-respecting culture where you're always dependent on the goodwill of somebody else.
Process when it comes to personal status law, especially in Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. And also, can you guys tell, like, comparatively speaking, like Shia women are doing better in terms of like Bahrain or Kuwait? Apparently they have their own Shia court, as far as I know. And also Oman, which has a different sect. Are women better in terms of their rights and status laws?
In Saudi Arabia, minorities don't have own references, so I don't know enough about that. But in terms of appeal process, there like a case that comes in mind. The case of a woman who was forced to divorce her husband by her brothers because of incompatibility of family names. So the judge divorced them based on a religious opinion that he followed, even though her father consented in the marriage. But after her father passed away, her brothers sued her and were able to divorce her. That case took a few years, got appealed to the highest level, and then it was reversed, and they were able to get married again. So there are cases where, unfortunately, I've never actually practiced in Saudi. When I graduated, women were not allowed to practice law yet. So I came immediately to Canada to do my master's and PhD. But it's from these public stories that I know that appeal is possible. But how does that work? And is it only because this specific case captured the media attention and public attention. So if it's because of that or whether it's, but yeah, I do believe that there is an appeal process.
There is an appeal process, basically. But the appeal process, for instance, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have to see your case at a different judge. So a higher court will look into the appeal. You don't have to be present as a woman in the higher court, right? So 3 judges would look into the whole case, and then they will refer their opinion to the original judge, and that will go back to the same judge. Not necessarily it will go to a different judge, but I've met women in Saudi Arabia who have challenged the opinions through the Supreme Council for Judges. So there is a process where you can really challenge that. But because the process is very complicated and lengthy, and women are often unable to access all those institutions, it might not be favorable by women. So they might cut, the whole route through intermediary means like involving other family members or involving influential community leaders, going outside the realm of law, basically, to resolve their issues. Or sometimes they would go for paying their way out of a marriage, like, as we said, al-khulu, or annulment of marriage, and instead of divorce, because that's quicker, right? So they might really go on a disadvantage. and accept that in compensation for their time and complexity of having to go through the appeal. And the minorities, you've answered that, but in other countries, like in Bahrain, they have a codification for Sunnis only, not for Shia minorities. And this was basically a debate on a level of political distrust. So religious Shiite people felt that they are not confident enough about the political system to enforce the draft of law that they believe is credible and valid by their authorities, by their religious authority. So they withdraw from basically enacting this type of law. As for other countries, they do have references for minorities. So minorities can, like in Kuwait, for instance, minorities can have their own sources for the law enforced.
In Lebanon, it's 15 different minorities and
Yeah.
15
So
different
it's very
types
complicated.
of sources.
Another I think, whole domain of which codes, again, going back to Dr. Fadel's, which codes do we need to see and which religious opinions, and do we need to codify when there is that many differences and diversity within a society?
The question is it we have to have the society ready and then the government will follow, or the government has to enforce the law, or it's both together? I think I was from the campaign of October 26, and we used we tried to show the world that the society is ready for driving. And we put a poll in the internet for 24 hours only. We have 17,000 signatures. And then the government closed the website. So we cannot continue to see if the society is ready or not. We went to the street. I drove myself for hundreds of times in Riyadh, in the most conservative area, and nobody told me anything. And you can check it in the YouTube. In the most conservative area, they will give me the thumb up. But the police stopped me, and I got detained twice. So we use the driving issue. It's not just because it's the most important thing, or because if it's the other issue is not important. We are using it as a sample to show that when the society readies to something, the government will not give it. When the opposite happened in the ladies in the Shura, the society rejected that. You know, there was 150 clerk went to Diwan Malaki, to the king court, to protest, and protesting is illegal in Saudi Arabia against this thing. And the second day, they put them all detained, and the Shura went to the ladies went to the Shura. So Saudi Arabia maybe has different than other country because we are absolute monarchy, and we don't have parliament like other Gulf states. So everything has to come from the king. And also, it's built in our society, the obedience of the king. So whatever the king say, the society will follow, even if it's against their value. They will follow. So in our society, everything has to come, I think, top to down. It's very because we have people are ready for driving. We have a lot of ladies ready for removing the guardianship. Just last week, 11,000 women went to court asking to remove their guardianship because the guardian is somebody who they don't know, either their stepfather, stepbrother, or a cousin they never seen, and they want to remove it, and they are still in court. 11,000 case. So I don't know.
The question is, when is the perfect time to abolish the system? And there is even though that this system is an Islamic-based system, but there's a relationship between women development and oil, and women participation in the political environment and the economic environment, and the oil prices and the revolution of oil. So do you believe that it's the chance to abolish the system since the current, with the current economical change in Saudi Arabia?
So in Islamic law, there's an idea of hajr. Hajr is like to be interdicted, prevented from acting for yourself. And the fuqaha say that, you know, there are asbab for hajj. Being a woman is not one of them, right? Having the capacity to manage your property properly, right? You know, otherwise being of sound mind, etc. You know, a person that is of sound mind and has enough intelligence to take care of her own property so that she's not, you know, ripped off all the time, etc. So she knows basic mathematics and can read and write, etc., right? That person should not be subject to control of her liberty, right? Just like a man, right? And so, as far as I know, in all the Gulf countries, they send girls to school, right? I see absolutely no reason why they should be subject to the control of somebody else, right? You don't have a principle in Islamic law that I can control you because you might embarrass me, right? That every person is responsible for his or her own conduct, right? If you do something that's shameful or whatever, that's for you, not on me, right? But I can't certainly prevent you from living your life just because I'm worried about how it's going to impact me, right? I mean, if that would take away any sort of responsibility that you have for yourself. So I see no reason to justify this continued wardship over women except for, you know, basically the customary law that prevailed in the peninsula for a long time, right? And I think the only thing that maintains it is the fact that that oil subsidizes all sorts of customs that couldn't survive in the absence of free money. If you didn't have free money, none of these rules could sort of continue in operation. And I think that's one reason why a lot of people are indifferent to it, because, you know, more or less they're living much better than they were 100 years ago, right? And so what's to complain about, right? Things are, you know, I mean, I'm guessing that's what a lot of people think. What's to complain about? I live so much better than my grandparents. Why should I complain, right?
I just want to comment that I agree with Dr. Fadel, and I believe, like, specifically in Saudi, oil money and our economic situation have enabled most families to have, for example, domestic workers, private drivers, and so on. So that kind of situation took away women's role not only outside the house because they didn't need to work because one income was enough, but also inside the house because they had domestic workers. So a woman lost her bargaining power, lost her ability to use, and then like the women are queens or women are came up. So it kind of took away women's ability to demand or to bargain or to use her role as a bargaining card. But now situation is changing and more families are needing two incomes, and it's becoming harder to keep living that way. In terms of, is there a good time to abolish the system? I believe that it should happen gradually. Start by securing women's rights that are already recognized but can't access because of the male guardianship system, and then slowly remove the system. And it will happen because of women need it more than ever, because partly economic situation, but also like the way of life is just changing.
Two comments, and then I have a question. I mean, first of all, I think we should be very careful when underestimating the value of the personal status law that we have today in the region. They were not granted. They came after a long battle and like daily battles that are still taking place before we have these personal status law. Yes, the implementation is very challenging, and it is very challenging partially not because only of the culture. Yes, the culture is there, but also why did it not help the culture to change is that also these governments did not take in the necessary steps also to reform the educational system, as it was mentioned. So it is reinforcing this culture. The media also, we still see many of these media messages and programs and etc. So we should be very careful underestimating. We need these laws. They are needed. There is still ongoing battles to have these, and also because when we it is always an ongoing debate whether we will wait for the society to be ready or the law, but the laws are very important because definitely they have an impact on the behavior of the citizens, because when you go and the law tells you no, you need to do this, that's an impact. It gives you the chance to reconsider your behavior and your attitude and your ideas. And also, the implementation of the laws is always challenging, and it takes courage. It takes to take the necessary approach, I mean, we can take the case, for example, here in the US, we have this well-established democracy with this historic constitution, but we always see the debate about the interpretation of some amendments. So the implementation on the interpretation of the law is always going to be challenging. But and on the other hand, also, because if we are talking about reform comes with institutions and with legal frameworks, because they are the terms of reference. So please, we should be very careful in underestimating the value of these laws and their existence, even if the situation and the culture is very challenging, and the environment in general. I mean, second, I'd just like to go back to the question about the Morshidat. I mean, because I'm familiar with this as a Moroccan American. So while the idea of the Morshidat and the programs that have been, as Dr. Fadel said, it may be very basic because it's basic religious teaching and it's also literacy and etc. But I think it's very, very meaningful on the impact on its impact and the message it sends when it comes to the presence and the role of women also in religion. It has challenged the idea that the religious sphere is only male-dominated. It sent the message that women have also a say in religion, and they can also interpret the religious text if men are also. And it relates to what Dr. Hala said. That's when you need to treat these religious leaders as every ordinary citizen. So I think it was very well. It sent a very clear message, and it had an impact on the societal and the behavioral attitude of the ordinary citizen, and also in terms of the use of public space. And lastly, my question is, if you can please elaborate on the role of the rule of law, and especially in terms of the judiciary of independence when it comes to personal status laws. Thank you.
From an ideal perspective, of course, what we want is the judges to follow whatever statutes or principles of law apply to the case at hand. Whether it's effective or not, of course, is an empirical question. And I certainly haven't gone and observed the workings of courts in any Arab country to know to what extent judges reliably and in good faith interpret the laws as written. My suspicion is that there's a high degree of deviation from the written law because the judicial machinery is relatively inefficient, right? Now, sometimes that can be fine because if they depart from the law in a way that the parties accept and et cetera, that could be perfectly good. In other circumstances, though, they could be subverting the aims of the rules. I don't know. It's just hard to say. Without an efficient system of appeals, right, it's really hard to have a lot of confidence in the judicial system. And I think, again, this goes back to a problem I said earlier, is if you have a chronically underfunded judiciary, it doesn't matter how good the rules are, right? And I know in countries like Egypt and Morocco, there's a chronically underfunded judiciary. So it doesn't matter how honest, how diligent, how sincere the judges are, and how good the substantive laws are. They're not going to be able to do their job in the way that we want them to, right? And that's why it always there's got to be a connection always with the actual institutions of governance. And so I think that needs as much attention to the substance of the laws, right? But yeah, I mean, what we want people to be treated fairly, right? And so even if the law is a bad law, there's a certain justice in requiring everybody to follow it, because that creates an incentive to change it. But if the well-to-do or the elite or those who are situated closely to the centers of power can avoid the impacts of bad laws, then that takes away an important voice to change the law, right? So even when the law is bad, we should want the law to be applied equally. Maybe especially when it's bad, we want the law to be applied equally, because that's what gives the incentive to change it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been very interesting, and thank you for our speakers for such insightful discussion, and for the audience for your great questions and comments. I'd like also to thank Tamara on the camera, and Mary for her actually support for the event, and Shore and Khadija and everyone who come today to this discussion. There will be a recording as well on the website afterwards. So thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you.